So let's start. Last lecture. Again, just like the previous one, it's going to be a couple of smaller parts, mainly secretion and bicarbonate reabsorption. So the first part will be secretion of organic anions and cations. This is basically a key part of elimination of drugs and foreign compounds. The largest part of this lecture is the bicarbonate transport, which is discussing the kidney's role in acid-base balance. You do have a podcast by Dr. Blackwell about acid-base balance. It discussed this topic in a more general term. The two key organs that regulate acid-base is the kidney. I'm going to discuss this in a little bit more detail than Dr. Blackwell's podcast. And I refer to other parts of this to her podcast. And then the final two parts, micturition and the endocrine function of the kidney, will be really short, to 2-3 slides each. So secretion and elimination of drugs and foreign substances. So the kidney, just the way it works, is an incredibly efficient organ to get rid of anything that you don't need. If you think about it, if you think about the key steps in kidney function, you filter an enormous amount of fluid and you reabsorb the things from it that you need. If you think about it, we discussed a bunch of different things of how you reabsorb sodium, potassium, calcium, whatnot, glucose, amino acids. But that being said, if you eat something or your body generates something that you don't need, all you need is just not to have something that reabsorbs it, right? So that's why you don't have to worry about that much about eating weird stuff, because we eat weird stuff all the time, and the kidneys will get rid of them as long as you don't have something to reabsorb it. That being said, though, for any foreign compound to get into your circulation, it needs to be absorbed in the intestines. And that means it has to cross cell membranes. So unless your intestines have some mechanism to absorb it, the only way to get through is if it's hydrophobic. The problem is, once it's hydrophobic, it doesn't dissolve well in water by definition, which means once it's in your plasma, some of it or all of it will bind to proteins. That's the problem. That's why you need something else, some additional mechanism. And it just happens so that many of the foreign stuff that we eat and medications and whatever, many of these things do bind to albumin to some extent. So they're not filtered as incredibly well as, say, glucose. And therefore, the kidney has a second mechanism to get rid of these things via secretion. So the kidney has two high capacity, low specificity transport mechanisms for weak acids and weak bases. These are also called organic anions and organic cations. And one example that we already discussed is para-aminohippuric acid, where we discussed that this compound is secreted in a very efficient manner, that it can clear the whole blood that goes through the kidney as long as you don't have too much para-aminohippuric acid. And the way it goes is, these two slides will not be super detailed in terms of what transporters you have. You have some kind of a transporter that this organic anion enters the cell. Again, this is low specificity. So it's para-aminohippuric acid and 5,000 other weak acids that can go through this transporter. And what you have on the other side is another quite low specificity pump mechanism, which uses ATP directly and pump out a bunch of different organic anions, including para-aminohippuric acid. And the other mechanism is a similar one for organic cations. Again, you have some form of entry mechanism and a pump that pumps these things out. This has changed how this mechanism worked from previous and before that textbooks. So this is a very simplified version. Some textbooks show much more complicated versions. Again, it changed substantially in the last couple of years. So this, what I depicted here, that's perfectly enough for now for your exam and to understand this mechanism. So again, I said this is a high capacity but low specificity mechanism. So this is a partial list of what this transporter can transport. The point here is not to remember every single molecule that is listed here. I want to go through a couple of points. Again, you have a large number of organic anions and you have a large number of organic cations that can be secreted. So some of these are hormones, for example, epinephrine, or neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, or cortisol, which is again a hormone. So many of these are hormones or neurotransmitters where you need fast turnover, and this secretion mechanism makes sure that these guys are quickly eliminated. The vast majority of these things are foreign compounds. I kind of emphasize the idea that this transport mechanism is there to get rid of foreign compounds. And again, some of these compounds are not very well filtered. The thing with organic anions and organic cations, these are weak acids and weak bases. So in a normal pH solution, most of them are protonated and therefore neutral, and therefore they are hydrophobic, and therefore this is an important mechanism to excrete them. There are a couple of other things highlighted here. We already discussed para-aminohippuric acid, so this is the mechanism it's secreted. I also highlighted glucuronides here. So I'm not sure if you had gastrointestinal yet or will come up. Had it? So glucuronides, it's the liver. The liver is the other detoxifying organ. So what the liver does, it basically takes a large number of different hydrophobic compounds and makes them hydrophilic. And one way it makes them hydrophilic is to attach a glucuronide residue on them. It's a relatively large hydrophilic stuff. And so what happens is those things that the liver attaches a glucuronide residue on, those don't only become more hydrophilic, therefore filtered better, but they can also be secreted by this mechanism. Another thing that's highlighted here is the pair of penicillin and probenecid. This is a classic example of the role of kidney in detoxification or elimination of drugs. And this goes back to ancient history when penicillin was a newly developed drug, which was in the Second World War when thousands of people were dying each day on the fronts. And of course, many people were injured, and penicillin was in very short supply. It's not like today when we have essentially unlimited supply. And somebody noticed that a cheap drug, a cheap compound, probenecid, if you take it together with penicillin, it actually extends the half-life of penicillin. And the reason for that is they compete for the same transport mechanism. So basically, if you take the cheap drug probenecid, eat it together with the then miracle drug penicillin, then you can improve the effect of penicillin. Of course, this was really ancient history, and it came back at one point, something like 10 years ago, before COVID, when there was one other virus scare, where we did have influenza medications, but just like penicillin 100 years ago or 80 years ago, it was in short supply. So people started to talk about probenecid again, that maybe we should use those stockpiles to enhance the effect of the influenza drug. Of course, those things did not pan out to be pandemics. Maybe it would work with COVID also, I'm not sure. Anyway, so this is a classical physiology slide similar to the glucose titration curve. It's just it's not with glucose, but with para-aminohippuric acid. Same things are plotted: filtered load, secretion, and excretion as the function of the plasma para-aminohippuric acid concentration. And just like for glucose, the filtered load is linear and the secretion at one point will saturate because those transporters have a transport maximum. And you can see that once the secretion is saturated, the excretion curve changes its steepness. So this is the range in the low concentration range when para-aminohippuric acid can be used to calculate renal plasma flow. Once you reach the saturation, it's not good anymore. And the other slide here shows the same with clearance. It's even noted here that the pH clearance equals the renal plasma flow at these low concentrations. And once saturation comes, the pH clearance decreases rapidly and basically gets closer and closer to the inulin clearance. Any questions on secretion? So the largest topic of this lecture is the CO2 bicarbonate buffer system, which is very important for acid-base balance. So the key reactions here is when CO2 combines with water, it forms carbonic acid, H2CO3, and carbonic acid would dissociate to protons and bicarbonate. And so all buffers are either weak acids or weak bases, and the idea is that if you have, for example, if you add acid to a system, any buffer system, what happens is it shifts the balance between the dissociated and the acid form. If you add more protons to the system, more will go to carbonic acid. If you take out protons from the system, the equilibrium will shift towards the deprotonated form, and basically, therefore, essentially it buffers the changes. This is what buffers are. And it can be quantitatively described by the association constant, which is when you divide the proton concentration times bicarbonate concentration, you divide that with the carbonic acid concentration, this is constant. And the usual way from whenever you learn about buffers in any physical chemistry or chemistry class, the buffer equation usually is solved for pH, which is a negative logarithm of proton concentration. And you have some kind of a constant plus the logarithm of the base form divided by the acid form. And in the case of the kidney, in the case of the bicarbonate CO2 buffer system, the bicarbonate concentration is expressed as the bicarbonate concentration, but instead of using carbonic acid concentration here, it's replaced by PCO2, which is the partial pressure of CO2, because CO2 in any solution is in equilibrium with the carbonic acid concentration. All you need is a constant, which is 0.03. And the reason it's PCO2, because that's what people measure in clinical practice as basically a respiratory and acid-based parameter. So if you learn about buffers in chemistry or physical chemistry, you may remember that this constant here, for a buffer to be good, this should be plus minus 1 pH units from the pH you want to buffer, because of the shape of the curve is such that once you're very low or very high, it's either completely deprotonated or completely protonated, so it won't make much difference. So from that standpoint, is this really a good buffer? Because you want to buffer pH 7.4, and we are like kind of a little bit far away. So it doesn't seem like a good buffer, right? It's not an ideal buffer that your chemistry teacher would say, this is what you should use, right? But in reality, this is an absolutely fantastic buffer. There's a reason why this is the buffer system used in biology and not HIPPIs or whatever else used in chemistry class. And the reason for that is that this is not a passive buffer. It's not just a bicarbonate solution. It's a biologically adjusted buffer. I just came up with that expression. The reason it's so good buffer, because what happens is your kidneys regulate the bicarbonate concentration and your lungs regulate the PCO2. So it's not just a passive buffer when you have protonation and deprotonation, but you have a biological intervention by two different organs, your kidneys and your lungs, with which you can change the bicarbonate concentration, and you can change the PCO2. So combined with this biological effect by the kidneys and the lungs, this is a really absolutely fantastic buffer, because not only you get protonation and deprotonation passively, but you can actively change both the acid form and the base form. And so one more thing to know, I think we discussed this in the sodium lecture, is that the hydration of the CO2 to form carbonic acid, generally it's good to have the carbonic anhydrase because it accelerates that reaction. So as I said before, everything is connected to the sodium lecture. We already had parts of this. So the reabsorption mechanism for bicarbonate is via basically secreting protons and the proton associating with bicarbonate to form CO2 and being reabsorbed in the form of CO2. We discussed this at the proximal tubule at the sodium lecture. Some little additions. So there we discussed the sodium proton exchanger. And as you will see later, there are two additional transport mechanisms which can directly pump protons out. These are the V-type and the HK-type ATPases. And on the basolateral side, you have two different mechanisms to reabsorb bicarb. One is the chloride bicarbonate exchanger, and you also have a sodium 3-bicarb cotransporter on the basolateral side. And as we discussed, acetazolamide, which inhibits the carbonic anhydrase enzyme, acts as a diuretic because it inhibits not only the bicarbonate reabsorption, but also that of sodium. Now, the same thing in the context of the nephron. So the proximal tubule, we already discussed it in the sodium lecture. It's mainly the sodium proton ATPase with a little contribution of the V-type and the KH-type ATPase. The basolateral mechanisms, which we discussed in the previous slide. And even though I did not specifically mention, but it was on the slide, that the thick ascending limb also reabsorbs a little bit of bicarb by this, mainly the sodium proton exchanger. So these we already had. And what this slide shows is the special cell type that is specialized for acid-base balance, which I believe I also mentioned in the sodium lecture. These are the so-called intercalated cells, which are in the same nephron segment as the principal cells, which is the collecting duct. And these, even though quantitatively they only reabsorb an additional 10% of the bicarbonate, the reason why these are important because here the ATPases, the direct pumps that can generate a much larger proton gradient, these dominate. So these guys can generate large proton gradients, which will be explained in a slide or two, the importance of this. So these cells secrete protons. There's an additional type of beta intercalated cell, less important, less prevalent than the alpha intercalated cell, which is the so-called beta intercalated cell. It's basically the same cell flipped. Instead of having a proton ATPase on the apical side facing the tubular fluid, it has an ATPase on the other side, on the basolateral side. And instead of bicarb exiting the cell on the basolateral side, bicarbonate here exits on the apical side. So these guys basically secrete bicarb. These guys reabsorb bicarb. And quite intuitively, if you're acidotic, if you're an acid load, even if you don't have acidosis, which is like a pathological version, even in normal everyday life, most of us are acid loaded. During metabolism, we generate all sorts of acids. So in the vast majority of time, these alpha intercalated cells are the dominant intercalated cells in your kidney. But if somebody becomes alkalotic for one reason or another, what happens is there will be less alpha intercalated cells and more beta intercalated cells. Basically, the kidney switches from one to the other, and the kidney can actually excrete bicarbonate by these cells. But again, normally, you mainly have alpha intercalated cells. So let's go to the next concept, because for so far, what I talked about is reabsorption of bicarbonate. And most of the time, though, we simply reabsorb all of the bicarbonate that we filtered, and most of the time, we still want to excrete more protons. As I said, we are usually acid loaded. And the issue is that once you eliminated all the bicarbonate, that's where the intercalated cells come in. But even when the intercalated cells with their specialized pumps pump protons against a large concentration gradient, there is a pH level where they will stop energetically. So the minimum pH, the highest proton gradient or minimum pH that these pumps can generate is pH 4.4. Once the urine is pH 4.4, stop. No more proton secretion, because you reach the maximum possible gradient energetically. And what you have in the kidneys to overcome this is two additional buffer systems. One of them is a titratable acids. So you have phosphate, uric acid, lactate, essentially any organic acid that you have in your blood, in addition to being an electrolyte to regulate, also serves as a titratable acid. So what happens is that after you reabsorb all bicarbonate, you still have some phosphate and lactic acid and whatever uric acid in your tubular fluid, and those will still buffer protons. And then what happens once, say, a phosphate buffered a proton, at the expense of that, on the basolateral side, you will have one bicarbonate leave the kidney. And the reason for that is that quantitatively, you can look at it in a way that essentially every proton in the body is always generated at the expense of also generating a bicarbonate. Because the major buffer is the CO2 bicarb system. You always have CO2 in your blood, and you always have carbonic acid in your blood because your metabolism generates CO2. So whenever the kidney secretes a proton, there will be a bicarbonate molecule generated. And the proton leaves the cell on the apical side, and the bicarbonate leaves the tubular cell on the basolateral side. So once you reabsorb all bicarbonate, you can still add bicarbonate to the blood by keep secreting protons, buffering it with titratable acids, and then at the expense of every secreted proton, at least quantitatively, you generate a new bicarbonate. So if you're acid loaded, the kidney doesn't only reabsorb the bicarb that you filtered, it also adds more bicarbonate to the blood. That's the mechanism of forming new bicarbonate. The problem, though, is that there's so much titratable acids, because there's just so much phosphate, uric acid, lactate. If you're very heavily acid loaded, you can also overrun these guys, and once you overrun these buffers, then again you reach the minimal pH and you're in trouble. And for that, there is an additional buffer system, which is the ammonia buffer system, which again helps the formation of new bicarbonate even after you run out of titratable acids. And the way it goes is the kidney cells, mainly the proximal tubular cells, use the amino acid glutamine converted to alpha ketoglutarate, and in this reaction, they generate ammonia. Ammonia, or NH3, is a weak base. It can be protonated to form ammonium, and ammonium, interestingly, can be transported in some isoforms of the sodium proton exchanger, and so ammonium can go through in exchange for sodium and land in the tubular lumen. And the alternative way of getting ammonium in the urine is that ammonia, without being protonated, is a gas. It's permeable to the membrane, so it can go out, it can diffuse out directly and can get protonated by a proton, which is secreted by the sodium proton exchanger. Again, the end result is, whichever way you go, is ammonium in the urine and bicarbonate generated at the expense of the proton, which will leave on the basolateral side. The bottom line is ammonia is an additional buffer system which can help generate more bicarbonate if needed. And the nice thing about this one is that this can be regulated, as opposed to titratable acids, where you just secrete whatever, where you filter whatever you have in your blood plasma. The kidney can actually increase the formation of glutamate, of ammonium when needed. And when it is needed is when you're acidotic. So this is just a summary. The proximal tubule forms 15 millimole per day of titratable acids and 40 millimole per day maximum of ammonium ions if needed. The later segments form additional 15 millimole per day titratable acids. And so the overall daily proton excretion can be as much as 70 millimole. And don't worry about the numbers. The key point is that if the take-home message of this whole part of the lecture, if your plasma pH is low, or in other words, you're acidotic, what happens is that the kidney is going to increase the formation of new bicarbonate at the expense of titratable acids and ammonia. It's going to make the urine acidic, and it's going to bring back your plasma pH closer to normal. So basically, if your plasma pH is low, the kidneys are going to generate bicarbonate, and it's going to help buffer the low pH. And if the opposite happens, if you're alkalotic, you're going to excrete bicarbonate by the way of either not reabsorbing it fully, or in addition by the beta intercalated cells, and you essentially decrease your bicarbonate concentration. So basically what the kidney does, if you're acidotic, it makes more bicarb. If you're alkalotic, it loses bicarb, and therefore plays an active role in buffering the blood pH to close to normal. Again, you're going to have a whole podcast by Dr. Blackwell, but the additional regulatory mechanism is your lungs. There, what happens if you're acidotic, you breathe faster, you get rid of CO2, and again, it helps buffer the pH. Any questions on bicarb? You're almost done. We get through the real kidney physiology. What's left is just the little things. So all what we discussed so far is filtering, reabsorbing fluids, whatever. And then basically the tubular fluid will, at the end, in the collecting duct, is going to get collected in the renal pelvis, and then it's going to go to the ureters, and through the ureters, it is going to go down to the urinary bladder when it's stored for conveniently excreting it. So the bladder can hold up to half a liter of urine, and the smooth muscle in the wall is called the detrusor muscle. It is smooth muscle, and it's innervated by parasympathetic nerves. So urination is a parasympathetic reflex. And there are two sphincters that prevent urine from leaking. One is the internal sphincter, which is innervated by sympathetic nerves, and the external sphincter, which is striated muscle, and it's innervated by somatic nerves. So basically, kids below 2 years of age rely on this internal sphincter. And whenever the reflex starts, they pee into their diapers. When they're toilet trained, they relied on the external sphincter, and they can control when they urinate. So the urge to urinate starts around 150 milliliters of bladder volume. It is sensed by somatic sensory nerves. And what happens is the higher centers in the pons inhibit this detrusor muscle, and they keep the sphincters contracted and prevent urination. And micturition starts when you voluntarily relax the external sphincters, and then that gives a signal to the upper centers to stop inhibiting the parasympathetic nerves, and basically you get this parasympathetic reflex to urinate. So that was a very short version of micturition. And then the only thing left is the endocrine functions of the kidney. The renin-angiotensin II system we discussed in detail at the sodium lecture. So I'm not going to talk much about it here. The two additional hormones which has very little to do with the kidney. One is calcitriol, or active vitamin D3. I mentioned this already. And erythropoietin, which has absolutely nothing to do with the kidney function, but it happens to be needed in the kidneys. And the reason to discuss it here, reason it's important to know, if somebody's kidneys are failing, usually both active vitamin D3 and erythropoietin are deficient. People end up with bone problems and with anemia, and these hormones these days can be replaced, and that's part of treatment of kidney failure in addition to dialysis. So calcitriol, or active vitamin D3, or 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D3, is generated by vitamin D3, which itself doesn't have an awful lot of biological activity. You probably know that if you want vitamin D3, you either go to the sun to get some light exposure, mainly some mild UV irradiation, or you take vitamin D from the drugstore, from the pharmacy. And the way vitamin D becomes active is step number 1, the liver will hydroxylate the vitamin D molecule in the 25 position. This is not regulated, and 25 hydroxy D3 is still not active. What makes it active is the 1-alpha hydroxylase enzyme, which is in the kidney, and it is mainly stimulated by parathyroid hormone and also by hypocalcemia. And vitamin D3 has a lot of different effects. You will get the details in the endocrine physiology, but the key effect of vitamin D3 is the effect on intestinal calcium absorption, because for one reason or another, parathyroid hormone is not very efficient in stimulating the intestines. So if you have vitamin D deficiency, you're deficient in absorbing absorbing calcium from the intestines, and you end up in negative calcium balance. So lack of vitamin D is also called rickets. It used to be called by not getting enough sun exposure. It's probably pretty rare these days because everybody's taking vitamin D. And I already mentioned this, that if somebody's in kidney failure, the lack of calcitriol will cause bone problems and secondary hyperparathyroidism. And erythropoietin is made in the kidneys, in the cortical fibroblasts. You probably all know this, that erythropoietin is the hormone to stimulate the formation of red blood cells, hypoxia being the major stimulus. So if you want to do well on the Olympics, you can do two things. One, go up to Mexico City and train there in high altitude, or whatever else place which is at high altitude, or you can inject erythropoietin, which is illegal. So that's erythropoietin. And as I mentioned, the reason why it's discussed in the kidney lectures is because patients in kidney failure become anemic, and so they require erythropoietin substitution. So that's pretty much the end of it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, feel free to email, and thank you very much for your attention.